a gleaming private jet touches down on a runway in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The year is 1987, and stepping off that aircraft is a man whose next few hours will forever change the landscape of American Christianity. Kenneth Copeland, already worth millions through his televangelism empire, is about to make a purchase that will scandalize the faithful and solidify a new doctrine that has nothing to do with ancient scriptures and everything to do with cold, hard cash. What he buys that day isn't just real estate. It's the physical manifestation of what scholars would later call the most successful theological con game in American history. The transaction involves $33 million, and it will help birth a movement that transforms Jesus Christ from a humble carpenter who said it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven, into something entirely different, a cosmic venture capitalist who wants his followers to get rich. This is the untold story of how American evangelicalism became a money-making machine that would make Wall Street executives blush. It's a tale of private jets justified as divine transportation, of mansions blessed as prayer retreats, and of poor congregants sending their last dollars to preachers who promise that God wants them wealthy, while those same preachers count millions in offshore accounts. The corruption didn't happen overnight. It took decades of careful theological engineering, brilliant marketing, and the exploitation of humanity's deepest hopes and fears. What emerged was a bastardized version of Christianity that the apostles wouldn't recognize, wrapped in biblical language but serving mammon with unprecedented devotion. But our story doesn't begin with Kenneth Copeland's shopping spree in 1987. It begins much earlier in the aftermath of World War II, when a struggling insurance salesman named Norman Vincent Peale was crafting a message that would eventually sediment into the bedrock of prosperity theology. Peele wasn't even an evangelical in the traditional sense, but his book, The Power of Positive Thinking, contained the DNA of what would become the billionaire gospel. Peele's revolutionary insight was simple: repackage self-help psychology in Christian terminology. God wasn't just interested in saving souls anymore. He was interested in improving your circumstances. This was Christianity as cosmic self-improvement, and it sold like hotcakes to a post-war America drunk on optimism and material prosperity. What Peele couldn't have foreseen was how this seemingly harmless message would metastasize into something far more sinister in the hands of more ambitious preachers. Enter Oral Roberts, a Pentecostal preacher who took Peele's positive thinking and turbocharged it with divine promises of financial return. Roberts didn't just suggest that God wanted you to think positively, he guaranteed that God would financially reward your faith. In 1955, he introduced the concept of seed faith, the idea that money given to God's work would return to the giver multiplied, just like seeds planted in fertile soil. Roberts was a master showman who understood the power of spectacle. His healing crusades drew tens of thousands, and his direct mail campaigns generated millions. But perhaps his greatest innovation was the blessing pact, a contract between the believer and God where specific monetary gifts would yield specific divine returns. Send $50, receive a 100-fold blessing. Send 100, get a 1,000-fold return. It was Christianity reimagined as a divine pyramid scheme. The genius of Roberts' system was its built-in defense mechanism against failure. When the promised financial blessings didn't materialize, the fault lay not with the preacher or the theology, but with the giver's insufficient faith. This created a feedback loop where disappointed followers were encouraged to give even more money to demonstrate their faith and unlock their delayed blessings. Roberts legitimized his movement by founding Oral Roberts University in 1963, complete with a medical school that would, he claimed, train doctors who would merge medicine with prayer. The university's centerpiece was the Prayer Tower, a gleaming modernist structure that Roberts claimed was designed according to a divine vision. But the real innovation was how Roberts used the university to transform himself from a tent revival preacher into an educational leader, lending academic credibility to what critics called sophisticated religious fraud. The transformation of Roberts from healer to educator revealed something crucial about the prosperity gospel's evolution. This wasn't just about charismatic personalities exploiting the credulous. This was about building institutional infrastructure that could sustain and expand the movement across generations. Roberts understood that to truly corrupt American evangelicalism, you needed more than tent revivals and television shows. You needed universities, seminaries, and media empires that could train new generations of prosperity preachers. But Roberts was just the opening act. The real architect of the billionaire gospel was a former used car salesman, turned insurance agent, turned preacher named Kenneth Hagin. If Roberts gave prosperity theology its marketing strategy, Hagin gave it its theological foundation. Working out of a small operation in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Hagin spent the 1960s and 1970s developing what he called word of faith theology. Hagin's innovation was to take the idea of positive confession, that believers could speak things into existence through faith-filled words, and weaponize it for financial gain. According to Hagin, Jesus didn't just die for humanity's sins, he died to break the curse of poverty. God didn't want his children poor any more than a loving father would want his kids to live in lack. Poverty wasn't just unfortunate, it was unbiblical. The theological gymnastics required to support this position were impressive. Hagin reinterpreted Jesus' warnings about wealth as warnings about attachment to wealth. Christ's voluntary poverty became a sacrifice meant to ensure believers' prosperity. The eye of the needle became a metaphor for humility, not an indictment of riches. Every biblical passage that seemed to contradict prosperity theology was explained away through creative hermeneutics that would make medieval scholastics proud. Hagin's real genius lay in systematizing these ideas into a reproducible methodology. He established Rhema Bible Training Center in 1974, which became the West Point of prosperity theology, training thousands of preachers in the fine art of extracting money from congregants in God's name. Students learned not just theology, but marketing techniques, psychological manipulation tactics, and sophisticated fundraising strategies disguised as spiritual disciplines. The timing couldn't have been better. The 1970s were a decade of economic uncertainty, spiritual seeking, and cultural upheaval. Traditional mainline Protestant churches seemed increasingly irrelevant to many Americans, while the Catholic Church was struggling with modernization and scandal. Into this vacuum stepped a new breed of evangelical entrepreneurs offering spiritual solutions to material problems. These weren't the fire and brimstone fundamentalists of earlier generations. These were smooth, media-savvy operators who promised that following Jesus would improve your credit score. They traded condemnation for motivation, guilt for gratitude, and sacrifice for success. It was Christianity 2.0, optimized for consumer satisfaction and repeat business. By this point, you might be wondering how this story connects to your own life. Whether you're watching this from a bustling city apartment at dawn before work, or from a rural farmhouse late at night, whether you're a teacher grading papers or a construction worker on break, this movement has shaped the religious and political landscape you inhabit in ways you probably never realized. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we excavate the hidden histories that explain our present moment. If you're finding value in this investigation into how money corrupted American Christianity, consider supporting this channel with a super thanks. Your contribution helps us continue uncovering the stories that powerful institutions would prefer remained buried. But let's return to our investigation because by the early 1980s, the prosperity gospel had gained enough momentum to attract a new breed of entrepreneur. These weren't just preachers, they were religious industrialists who understood that God's work required serious capital investment. And nowhere was this more evident than in the rise of televangelism as a billion-dollar industry. The deregulation of television broadcasting in the 1980s created unprecedented opportunities for religious programming. Suddenly, preachers could buy airtime on cable networks and reach millions of homes simultaneously. But television was expensive, and maintaining a media ministry required constant fundraising on an industrial scale. This economic pressure would push prosperity theology to new extremes of exploitation and theological innovation. Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker understood this better than anyone. Their PTL, Praise the Lord Network, wasn't just a television ministry, it was a multimedia entertainment empire complete with theme parks, luxury hotels, and retail operations. The Bakers sold lifetime partnerships in their Heritage USA theme park, essentially religious timeshares marketed as investments in God's kingdom. For $1,000, supporters could buy annual vacation privileges in perpetuity. For higher amounts, they could purchase luxury accommodations and exclusive access to Jim and Tammy's personal fellowship. The mathematics of this scheme were breathtaking in their audacity. The Bakers sold far more partnerships than their facilities could accommodate, using new partnership money to pay for previous commitments, while skimming millions for their personal use. When the scheme inevitably collapsed, it was revealed that Jim Bakker had sold over 100,000 partnerships in hotel rooms that didn't exist, collecting over $150 million in the process. But the PTL scandal, which broke in 1987, did something unexpected. Instead of destroying the prosperity gospel movement, it taught its leaders valuable lessons about operational security and legal protection. The surviving prosperity preachers didn't abandon their methods. They refined them. They learned to structure their finances more carefully, to create legal barriers between their ministries and personal wealth, and to develop more sophisticated theological justifications for their lifestyles. Kenneth Copeland emerged as the movement's most successful student of these lessons. That 1987 real estate purchase we mentioned at the beginning? Copeland bought his own airport, complete with a private runway and hangar facilities. When questioned about the extravagance, Copeland explained that commercial airlines were a long tube with a bunch of demons that prevented him from prey effectively while traveling. His private jet wasn't luxury, it was spiritual necessity. This reasoning became a template for justifying virtually any expenditure. Mansions weren't self-indulgence. They were prayer retreats where ministry leaders could seek divine guidance without distraction. Luxury cars weren't status symbols. They were reliable transportation for God's ambassadors. Expensive clothes weren't vanity. They were appropriate attire for representing the King of Kings. Copeland's theological innovation went beyond creative justifications for wealth. He developed what he called prosperity principles that transformed giving into a mechanical process with guaranteed returns. According to Copeland, God operated according to spiritual laws that were as predictable as natural laws. Just as dropping a ball would reliably cause it to fall, giving money to God's work would reliably produce financial increase. This mechanistic approach to divine blessing removed personal relationships, moral complexity, and mystery from religious experience. God became a cosmic vending machine. Insert faith and money, receive predetermined blessings. The apparent randomness of life, why good people suffered while bad people prospered, was explained away through formulas involving faith, confession, and seed offerings. But Copeland's real genius was organizational. He created Kenneth Copeland Ministries as a sophisticated operation that combined media production, direct marketing, conference management, and financial services. His Believer's Voice of Victory television program reached millions of homes daily, while his magazines, books, and audio materials created multiple revenue streams from the same content. Annual conventions generated millions in attendance fees while serving as massive sales events for ministry products. The economic model was brilliant in its simplicity. Television programming served as advertising for books, conferences, and special offerings. Books and materials created ongoing relationships with supporters who received increasingly aggressive fundraising appeals. Conferences provided opportunities for high-pressure sales tactics disguised as altar calls. And special offerings, often tied to artificial deadlines or manufactured crises, generated massive windfalls that funded lifestyle expansion and media growth. Other prosperity preachers refined this model further. Creflo Dollar built an empire around credit and debt counseling, teaching followers to use faith principles to improve their credit scores and access better financing. Dollar's approach was particularly insidious because it mixed legitimate financial advice with prosperity theology, making his religious claims seem credible by association with practical strategies. Dollar's ministry marketed itself as Christian financial education, but the real product was getting followers comfortable with debt in service of religious giving. Dollar taught that borrowing money to give to ministry wasn't irresponsible. It was an act of faith that demonstrated confidence in God's promised returns. Followers were encouraged to use credit cards for offerings, take out loans for special projects, and even mortgage their homes to fund ministry expansion. The psychological manipulation involved in these systems was sophisticated and ruthless. Prosperity preachers employed techniques borrowed from sales psychology, behavioral economics, and social influence research. They understood that people in financial distress were most susceptible to promises of supernatural intervention. They knew that creating artificial scarcity, limited time offerings, exclusive opportunities, numbered prayer cloths could motivate immediate action. They recognized that public commitments were harder to break than private decisions, so they created elaborate altar call productions where followers pledged specific amounts in front of hundreds or thousands of witnesses. Perhaps most cruelly, they weaponized hope itself. For people trapped in poverty, struggling with medical bills, or facing financial ruin, prosperity theology offered something that secular financial advice couldn't: the promise that God Himself was invested in their economic success. The greater someone's desperation, the more appealing these promises became. And when the promised breakthroughs failed to materialize, the fault was always with the believer's insufficient faith, inadequate giving, or impure motives, never with the theology itself. The human cost of this exploitation was enormous, though carefully hidden from public view. Churches across America filled with people who had bankrupted themselves, funding preachers' lifestyles while their own families struggled. Elderly retirees sent their Social Security checks to television ministries, believing they were investing in divine returns that never came. Young families took on crushing debt to demonstrate their faith, only to lose their homes when God failed to honor the promissory notes they'd been taught He'd signed. Meanwhile, the prosperity preachers themselves lived in unprecedented luxury. Paula White, who would later become Donald Trump's spiritual advisor, owned multiple multi-million-dollar homes and a fleet of luxury vehicles. Joyce Meyer's ministry owned several corporate jets and luxury properties worldwide. Joel Osteen inherited Lakewood Church from his father and transformed it into a multimedia empire that generated tens of millions annually, while he lived in a mansion worth over $10 million. The theological innovations required to justify these lifestyles became increasingly baroque. Osteen developed theology of optimism that essentially eliminated sin, judgment, and sacrifice from Christianity. According to Osteen, God wasn't angry about anything, never allowed bad things to happen to good people, and wanted everyone to live their best life now. This wasn't Christianity as much as therapeutic deism wrapped in biblical language. Osteen's approach was particularly effective because it felt positive and affirming rather than manipulative and demanding. He rarely asked for money directly, instead creating an emotional atmosphere where grateful followers wanted to support his ministry. His books became bestsellers not because they contained profound theological insights, but because they offered spiritual permission for materialistic ambition. Wanting wealth wasn't selfish, it was God's desire for your life. The institutional infrastructure supporting prosperity theology continued expanding throughout the 1990s and 2000s. Oral Roberts University was joined by other institutions that trained prosperity preachers and legitimized their message. Rhema Bible College graduated thousands of ministers who spread word of faith theology globally. Christian television networks like TBN provided platforms for prosperity preachers to reach international audiences and solicit funds from developing nations where American wealth seemed like evidence of divine blessing. The globalization of prosperity theology created new opportunities for exploitation. American preachers began conducting miracle crusades in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, where their message found fertile ground among populations struggling with poverty and political instability. The irony was breathtaking. American millionaires were extracting money from some of the world's poorest communities by promising that God wanted them rich. This international expansion revealed something crucial about prosperity theology's true nature. Rather than empowering people to improve their circumstances, it typically made them poorer while enriching the preachers. Studies of prosperity theology's impact in developing nations showed that communities exposed to these teachings experienced decreased economic mobility and increased inequality. Far from delivering divine prosperity, the theology seemed to function as a wealth extraction mechanism that moved money from the poor to the rich, while convincing its victims that their poverty was evidence of spiritual failure. But the prosperity gospel's most significant corruption wasn't financial, it was theological. By the early 2000s, entire denominations had been transformed by prosperity theology's influence. Churches that had historically emphasized salvation, service, and sacrifice were now focused on success, prosperity, and personal advancement. The gospel message that had once comforted the afflicted now afflicted the comfortable with guilt about their insufficient faith and inadequate giving. Traditional Christian virtues were systematically redefined to support prosperity theology. Humility became thinking God's thoughts about yourself, which conveniently included believing you deserved wealth and success. Self-sacrifice became sowing seeds for future harvest, transforming giving into investment strategy. Faith became a technology for manipulating divine blessing rather than trust in God's providence regardless of circumstances. This theological transformation had profound political implications. Prosperity theology aligned perfectly with American capitalism's promise that individual effort and positive thinking could overcome any obstacle. It also provided religious justification for ignoring structural inequalities and systemic injustices. If God wanted everyone rich, then poverty must result from personal spiritual failure rather than economic systems designed to benefit some at others' expense. The political utility of this message wasn't lost on conservative politicians, who began courting prosperity preachers as allies in promoting pro-business policies. The prosperity gospel became a theological cover for opposing social welfare programs, environmental regulations, and financial industry oversight. After all, if God wanted people prosperous, then any government interference with free markets was opposition to divine will. This political alliance reached its apex during Donald Trump's presidency, when prosperity preachers like Paula White, Kenneth Copeland, and Robert Jeffress became unofficial spiritual advisors to the administration. The irony was impossible to miss. Preachers who claimed to follow a savior who said, "My kingdom is not of this world," were now intimately involved in worldly political power, while those who taught that God wanted everyone wealthy were supporting politicians whose policies primarily benefited those who were already rich. The Trump phenomenon revealed something important about prosperity theology's evolution. Over decades of theological innovation and institutional development, it had become less about religion and more about ideology. The prosperity gospel wasn't just corrupted Christianity. It was Christianity's corpse animated by capitalist spirit and dressed in biblical clothing. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this story is how thoroughly prosperity theology succeeded in reshaping American evangelical culture. By the 2010s, polls showed that most American Christians, including those who attended traditional churches, believed that God wanted them financially prosperous. The poison had spread from the margins to the mainstream, infecting denominations that had once preached prophetic messages about wealth's dangers. Young evangelicals raised in this environment couldn't imagine Christianity without prosperity elements. They might not send money to television preachers, but they still believed that faith should improve their circumstances, that God wanted them successful, and that poverty indicated spiritual problems. The prosperity gospel had become evangelical Christianity's default setting. This cultural transformation created new forms of exploitation that were subtler but no less damaging than classic prosperity preaching. Christian financial advisors sold investment products by claiming divine guidance. Biblical business coaches promised that spiritual principles would guarantee marketplace success. Faith-based multi-level marketing schemes recruited church members by suggesting that selling products was ministry opportunity. The corruption had become so complete that many evangelicals couldn't distinguish between biblical Christianity and baptized capitalism. They confused American prosperity with divine blessing, personal success with spiritual maturity, and material accumulation with spiritual growth. The prosperity gospel had achieved its ultimate victory, making itself invisible by becoming everything. Today, the prosperity gospel generates billions of dollars annually for its leading practitioners, while leaving millions of its followers financially and spiritually impoverished. Kenneth Copeland's net worth is estimated at over $700 million. Joel Osteen's annual income exceeds $50 million. Joyce Meyer's ministry controls assets worth hundreds of millions. These are the success stories of prosperity theology, not the transformed lives of followers, but the enriched bank accounts of leaders. Meanwhile, the spiritual landscape these preachers have created continues expanding. New generations of prosperity teachers have emerged, adapting the message for social media and online platforms. Instagram prophets promise their followers that positive thinking and generous giving will manifest dream lifestyles. YouTube preachers sell courses on biblical wealth building and kingdom entrepreneurship. The technology has evolved, but the fundamental exploitation remains unchanged. The billionaire gospel's legacy extends far beyond religious circles. It has shaped American culture's relationship with wealth, success, and moral responsibility. It has provided theological cover for extreme inequality while convincing many Americans that their economic struggles result from personal spiritual failure. It has corrupted Christian witness by associating the gospel message with greed, exploitation, and deceit. Perhaps most damaging, prosperity theology has inoculated millions of Americans against authentic Christianity by convincing them they've already experienced it. People who have been burned by prosperity preachers often reject all religious faith, unable to distinguish between the gospel of Jesus Christ and the counterfeit that exploited their trust. The prosperity theology movement hasn't just stolen money, it has stolen souls by making authentic spirituality seem like another scam. But this story isn't just about religious corruption or financial exploitation. It's about how skilled manipulators can hijack humanity's deepest longings for meaning, for hope, for transcendence, and redirect them toward their own enrichment. The prosperity gospel succeeded because it offered people what they desperately wanted: assurance that their struggles mattered, that their faith could change their circumstances, and that God was personally invested in their welfare. The tragedy is that these longings are legitimate, and the comfort people sought was real. But instead of genuine spiritual guidance, they were sold religious products designed to benefit sellers rather than buyers. Instead of communities of authentic faith, they found marketing operations disguised as churches. Instead of encountering the divine, they encountered very human greed wrapped in holy language. Understanding this history matters because the forces that created prosperity theology haven't disappeared. Religious authority remains powerful, human desperation continues driving people toward promised solutions, and charismatic leaders still discover that exploiting spirituality can be extraordinarily profitable. The specific tactics may evolve, but the fundamental dynamic persists. Those who claim to speak for God often end up speaking primarily for their own bank accounts. As we conclude this investigation into how money corrupted American evangelicalism, it's worth remembering that this story isn't finished. New forms of religious exploitation emerge constantly, adapted for contemporary circumstances but built on the same foundation of human vulnerability and spiritual manipulation. The prosperity gospel may have reached its institutional peak, but its methods and mindset continue influencing religious and secular culture alike. The billionaire gospel represents more than theological error or financial crime. It represents the systematic corruption of humanity's spiritual impulses for material gain. It shows how sacred traditions can be perverted to serve profane purposes, how divine language can disguise worldly motives, and how religious institutions can become vehicles for exactly the kinds of exploitation they were created to prevent. Perhaps the most important lesson from this history is that authentic spirituality and genuine prosperity are never found through the methods prosperity theology promotes. Real spiritual growth typically requires confronting uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our world. Genuine prosperity involves much more than financial wealth, and lasting fulfillment comes from contributing to something larger than our personal success, rather than manipulating divine forces for individual benefit. The story of the billionaire gospel is ultimately a story about the price of corrupting the sacred for the sake of the profitable. That price, measured in damaged lives, lost faith, and missed opportunities for authentic transformation, dwarfs even the hundreds of millions that prosperity preachers have extracted from their followers. In seeking to gain the whole world, these religious entrepreneurs have lost something infinitely more valuable: their souls and the souls of those who trusted them. Understanding how this happened helps us recognize similar dynamics in other areas of life, and perhaps prevents future exploitation of our deepest human needs. Because if there's one thing the rise and reign of prosperity theology teaches us, it's that those who promise easy answers to hard questions usually profit more from our problems than from our solutions.